Encyclopedia Brown. Everyone's favorite boy detective and the Case of the Dead Eagles. By Ponald J. Sobel. 1. The Case of the Dead Eagles. In all the world there was no place like Idyllville, USA. Idyllville looked like many other seaside towns. It had beautiful beaches, 3 movie theaters, and 4 banks. It had churches, synagogues, and 2 delicatessens. What made Idyllville different was a red brick house at 13 Rover Avenue. For there lived Encyclopedia Brown, America's Sherlock Holmes in sneakers. Because of Encyclopedia, no one in Idyllville, child or grown-up, got away with breaking the law. Encyclopedia's father was chief of the Idyllville police. People all over the world, including China, thought he was the smartest police chief in history. Chief Brown knew better. Whenever he came up against a case that no one on the force could crack, he put on his cap and went home to dinner. Before the meal was over, Encyclopedia had solved the case. Chief Brown would have liked to shout from atop the stone heads carved into Mount Rushmore, "My son belongs here." But what good would it do? Who would believe him? Who would believe that the mastermind behind Idyllville's war on crime was 10 years old? So Chief Brown kept secret the help he got from his only child. Encyclopedia never said a word either. He didn't want to seem different from other 5th graders. But there was nothing he could do about his nickname. He was stuck with it. Only his parents and his teachers called him by his real name, Leroy. Everyone else in Idyllville called him Encyclopedia. An encyclopedia is a book or set of books filled with all kinds of facts from A to Z, like Encyclopedia's had. The boy detective had read more books than anyone in Idyllville. When he breathed fast, his pals swore they could hear pages turning. Encyclopedia's quick mind was in demand wherever he went. Not only did he solve cases at the dinner table, but often he was called upon to clear up a mystery when he least expected. Take, for example, the night he and Charlie Stewart were camping overnight in the state park. They had just pitched their tent when they heard a gunshot. "Gosh," exclaimed Charlie. "That wasn't far away." Encyclopedia threw a log on the fire. He pretended that he hadn't heard a thing. "It can't be a hunter," reasoned Charlie. "Hunters aren't allowed near the campgrounds." Encyclopedia slid a marshmallow onto a stick and turned it above the fire. Charlie stared at him in surprise and disappointment. "Don't you think we ought to do something?" Charlie said. "I mean, somebody might have been murdered." At times like this, Encyclopedia wished he had never become a private detective. "Catching a murderer isn't like recovering a stolen bike," he said. "A murderer can stop a person's growth in a terrible hurry." "But somebody might be hurt and need your help," insisted Charlie. Encyclopedia sighed. "All right, let's go." The boys walked through the woods, following a path that led in the direction of the gunshot. After a quarter mile, they reached a clearing. At the far end was a cliff about 40 feet high and 70 feet wide. Encyclopedia suddenly stepped to the edge of the path. He dropped to one knee beside a golden eagle. It was dead. "This explains the gunshot," he said, feeling anger and sorrow over the senseless killing. He looked about the clearing. The setting sun seemed to be resting atop the cliff. He had to shade his eyes before he saw the nest. It was in a cottonwood snag halfway up the cliff. He pointed out the nest to Charlie. Then he said, "I'll bet Mike Bailey is in the park." "What has Mike to do with the eagle?" said Charlie. "Don't you remember last year?" asked Encyclopedia. A year ago, 2 golden eagles had built a nest in a cottonwood snag lower down on the same cliff. Soon afterward, both birds were shot during the night. About 9 o'clock, an hour before the shooting, a scoutmaster noticed Mike Bailey standing on this path, said Encyclopedia. Mike carried a rifle. The scoutmaster could have been mistaken, said Charlie. It was dark. No, there was enough light, replied Encyclopedia. The moon was full. Charlie scratched his head. I wonder about that new nest, he said softly. He walked to the cliff and inched his way up. After a hard struggle, he got his chin above the nest. There are 2 eggs inside, he called down. The news made finding the mysterious hunter more important than ever. The eagle lying near the path was male. The shot that killed him probably had frightened off his mate. Once she recovered, she would return to hatch the eggs. We've got to find the hunter before he shoots the mother eagle, too, said Encyclopedia. The boys had only one lead, Mike Bailey. He was 16 and rode a motorcycle. It was dark when they found him at campsite 32. He had pitched his tent and was reading a hot rod magazine by the light of the kerosene lamp. Encyclopedia made out a green motorcycle behind the tent. A rifle lay against the black leather seat. Going hunting tonight? Inquired Encyclopedia. Nah, I just keep the gun handy, said Mike. I might see a rattlesnake. I don't like guns, said Charlie. Hunting is cruel unless you need food. And killing wildlife for fun is like murder. Oh, said Mike. You're one of those mouthy kids who believes guns should be outlawed. I believe we should have better laws to control guns, said Charlie. A gun doesn't shoot by itself, replied Mike sharply. A gun does what its owner makes it do. Don't control guns, kid. Cure the bad owners. You can say the same nonsense about automobiles, said Encyclopedia. Mike stiffened. Nonsense? Just what do you mean? An automobile does what its owner makes it do, said Encyclopedia. So while you're curing bad owners, get rid of all automobile laws, speed limits, traffic signals, driver's tests, fines, and jail terms. Move on, wise guy, growled Mike. Encyclopedia stood his ground. A golden eagle was shot in the clearing by the cliff less than an hour ago, he said. If you shot it, your rifle will still smell of powder. Take one step nearer my rifle and I'll break your leg, warned Mike. Last year 2 eagles were shot in the same clearing, said Charlie. A scoutmaster saw you studying their nest earlier that night. So I heard, said Mike. I was out walking and I had my gun along in case I saw rattlesnakes. I stopped to admire the full moon, which was right above the cliff. I didn't notice the nest, and I didn't shoot any eagles. You can't help where the moon is, said Encyclopedia. But you can help lying. What was Mike's lie? To the case of the hypnotism lesson. Throughout the year, Encyclopedia helped his father solve crimes at the dinner table. When school let out for the summer, he decided to help the children of the neighborhood as well. So he opened his own detective agency in the garage. Every morning after breakfast he hung out his sign. Business was slow on Thursday until Dave Foster walked in. Dave was 7 and full of questions. How do you tell a boy lobster from a girl lobster? He asked. The girl lobster has a longer tail, replied the boy detective. The answer wasn't worth 25 cents. Encyclopedia waited for more questions. Instead, Dave said, I think Bugs Meany cheated me. If I know Bugs, he did, said Encyclopedia confidently. Bugs Meany was the leader of a neighborhood gang of tough older boys. They called themselves the Tigers. They should have called themselves the Mountaineers. They were never on the level. If Bugs had his honesty taken out, it would be a 1-minute operation, said Encyclopedia. What did he do now? He charged me $1 to learn how to hypnotize a lobster, said Dave. Go over that again, said Encyclopedia. Dave explained. An hour earlier, he had passed the Tiger's clubhouse. Bugs and his pals had just returned from catching lobsters. They were seated around a boiling kettle, feasting. Bugs told me that he had caught 11 lobsters by hypnotizing them, said Dave. He asked if I wanted to learn the secret for $1. It was an offer you couldn't refuse, said Encyclopedia. I thought so, said Dave. Bugs picked up a big lobster, the kind you pay a lot of money for in a restaurant. He waved his right hand at it. The waving was for show, said Encyclopedia. He probably was squeezing the nerve centers on its back with his left hand. No, said Dave. He held it up by the tail and muttered a lot of hocus pocus. It didn't move a muscle. Finally, Bugs said, Okay, Lobster, are you going to do your stuff or do you want to go into the hot pot? With a choice like that, what's a lobster going to do? Said Encyclopedia. I wouldn't know, said Dave. All Bugs did was talk. He said a hypnotized lobster could stand on its head while balancing a ping-pong ball on its tail. And pass out business cards at the same time, added Encyclopedia. Oh, that Bugs. I didn't get to see one trick, complained Dave. Bugs said that my dollar paid only for a sample lesson. He told me I could start the course next week for $10. Dave laid 25 cents on the gasoline can beside Encyclopedia. I want to hire you to get back my dollar, he said. Bugs didn't teach me enough to hypnotize an eggplant. All I got for my money is this. He handed Encyclopedia a color photograph. It showed Bugs and Dave standing together. Bugs held up a large red lobster by the tail with his left hand. He aimed the fingers of his right hand at it like a magician. Rocky Graham, one of the tigers, snapped the picture with a self-developing camera, said Dave. Rocky told me to show it to my friends and tell them about the lessons. What a jip, said Encyclopedia. Let's pay Bugs a visit. The Tiger's clubhouse was an unused tool shed behind Mr. Sweeney's auto body shop. Bugs and 2 of his tigers were still eating lobsters when Encyclopedia and Dave arrived. Make like a drum and beat it, snarled Bugs. Give me back my dollar first, blurted Dave. When you took it, you didn't tell me I'd need more than one lesson to hypnotize a lobster. Man, oh, man, exclaimed Bugs. Nobody can learn overnight. It took me weeks. You didn't make that dumb old lobster do one trick, said Dave. That's because it was a girl lobster, replied Bugs. I told you, girl lobsters are hard for boys to hypnotize. Dave suddenly looked glum. Yeah, I forgot. I'd like to see you make it do a trick for me, put in Encyclopedia. Sorry, said Bugs. I ate it. In fact, me and the boys are eating the last of the catch right now. You big goon, cried Dave. You ate the evidence on purpose. Never mind, Dave, said Encyclopedia. We have enough proof that Bugs cheated you. What was the proof? 3. The case of the parking meters. Bugs Meany had one goal in life. It was to get even with Encyclopedia. Bugs hated being outsmarted. He longed to pound the top of Encyclopedia's head till the detective could pull up his socks by lifting his eyebrows. But Bugs never used force. Whenever he felt like it, he thought twice about Encyclopedia's partner, Sally Kimball. Once for each of her fists. Sally was not only the prettiest girl in the 5th grade, but the best athlete. She could do what Bugs never dreamed possible. Flatten him. Whenever they fought, the toughest tiger ended on the ground mumbling about railroad crossings. Bugs won't forgive you, Encyclopedia warned Sally. He'll never live down the lickings you gave him. The 2 detectives were seated in the brown garage. They were discussing the mysterious telephone call each had received during the week. Monday, a boy had called and asked Encyclopedia to meet him on important business at the Indian burial grounds at 3 o'clock that afternoon. The boy did not show up. Yesterday, Sally had received a call from a boy asking her to meet him at the old deserted airstrip at 7 o'clock that evening. Like Encyclopedia, she had waited without seeing a soul. Bugs Meany is behind this, said Sally. It's some kind of plot to get revenge. Mr. Brains and Miss Muscles, hollered Bugs. Just then a police car stopped in the driveway. Bugs and Officer Culp got out. There they are, hollered Bugs. Mr. Brains and Miss Muscles. Private detectives, my eyeball. They should be in jail. What's he shouting about? Asked Encyclopedia. Bugs claims that you go along the streets saving drivers from $5 parking fines, said Officer Culp. He says you put dimes in meters and leave a card like this. He gave Encyclopedia a card. It read, "Hi. You have just been saved from a $5 parking ticket by the Robin Hood parking aid. Your time on the meter had run out. Could you please send $2 so I may continue to bring you and others this service?" The card was signed Robin Hood. The address given was Encyclopedia's home, 13 Rover Avenue, Idaville. He must be raking in money, said Bugs. I'll bet he doesn't report a cent of it to the government. Officer Culp seemed uncomfortable. I'm not sure if any law has been broken, he said. We'll have to let a judge decide. Man, oh, man, exclaimed Bugs. The son of our police chief dragged into court. What a disgrace! You don't have a shred of proof, Encyclopedia protested. I had proof, retorted Bugs. Monday afternoon about 3 o'clock I took movies of you feeding a parking meter. But this screwy dame stole the film. I did what? Gasped Sally. Officer Culp broke in. Bugs claims he picked up the developed film yesterday. At 7 o'clock in the evening he showed it in his living room to his pals. Just as the film ended, you jumped through the window, Bugs said to Sally. You grabbed the reel right off the movie projector. You're lying through the hole in your head, cried Sally. This is a dirty trick to get us in trouble. I chased you across my backyard, went on Bugs. When you passed under the streetlight, I saw that you didn't have the film anymore. You must have got scared and tossed it away in the dark. Where were you Monday at 3 o'clock? Officer Culp asked Encyclopedia. And where were you yesterday at 7? He said to Sally. Encyclopedia explained about the telephone calls that had drawn him to the Indian burial grounds and Sally to the old airstrip. Neither of them had a witness. Some alibis, jeered Bugs. I've heard better ones from a horse with lockjaw. Officer Culp decided to settle the argument by driving the children to Bugs' house. He had them search the backyard for the missing reel of film. After 2 minutes, Bugs shouted, I've got it. He held up a reel of film. No wonder I couldn't find it before. The wind blew a newspaper over it. Bugs set up a movie projector and screen in his living room. Grinning, he put on the reel, threaded the film, and clicked the starting switch. Most of the film showed Bugs and his tigers making mussels at the beach. The last bit of film was of a boy dressed in sneakers, jeans, and a red shirt like one of Encyclopedia's. He put a coin in a parking meter. Then he tucked a card under the windshield wiper of the car by the meter. You saw him with your own eyes, sang Bugs. That doesn't prove anything, objected Sally. We never saw the boy's face. She was plainly worried, however. That boy looks like you from the back, she whispered to Encyclopedia. Bugs has really built a case against us. No, against himself, said Encyclopedia. What was Bug's mistake? For the case of the hidden will. Tuesday evening Chief Brown sat at the dinner table and stirred his soup thoughtfully. Encyclopedia knew what that meant. His father had brought home a case he couldn't solve. Do you remember Brandon King? Asked Chief Brown. He owned the largest lumberyard in this part of the state, replied Encyclopedia. He died last week in Glen City. What is the mystery, dear? Asked Mrs. Brown. Mr. King hid his will, said Chief Brown. It tells who will get all his money and possessions. Doesn't his lawyer know where the will is? Inquired Encyclopedia. Yes, but Mr. King swore him to secrecy, replied Chief Brown. Last summer Mr. King wrote the lawyer ordering him not to tell where it is until 90 days after his death. If the will is not found by then, everything he owned is to go to the Magicians' Union. I visited his home 4 years ago, said Mrs. Brown. The basement was filled with all kinds of strange equipment. He had a box in which people disappeared. In another box he could saw a person in half. Magic was only one of his hobbies, said Chief Brown. He was also a champion card player. The walls of his playroom were hung with framed enlargements of every card in the deck. Chief Brown took a spoonful of soup. Then he went on. The chances are that Mr. King's sons will inherit everything. His wife died 8 years ago, and he has no other relatives. The sons helped him in the business, didn't they? Said Mrs. Brown. Yes, answered Chief Brown. But Mr. King didn't think much of them, I'm sorry to say. In fact, his friends believed that one of the sons was stealing from the business. Didn't Mr. King know about it? Asked Mrs. Brown. Of course he did, but he never would say which son was the thief, replied Chief Brown. Whoever he is, he's been left out of the will. How can you be so sure? Declared Mrs. Brown. No one knows where the will is hidden except the lawyer. Did he tell you? No, but he gave me this, said Chief Brown, unbuttoning his breast pocket. He drew out a sheet of paper and handed it to Mrs. Brown. 9 months ago Mr. King sent a copy to each of his 4 sons, continued Chief Brown. The lawyer received this, the original. Mrs. Brown peered at the paper. I'm not certain I understand it, she said, and passed it to Encyclopedia. On the paper was typed a poem. Encyclopedia read, Idaville? For kings worked for me, if badly. One stole when I wasn't about. Still, I've willed all I have to 3, and left the odd king out. Encyclopedia studied the poem as his mother cleared the soup dishes. She looked at him anxiously while she served the meatloaf and vegetables. She always expected him to solve his father's toughest cases before dessert. So Encyclopedia ate slowly. He needed time with this one. How did you come into the case, Dad? He asked. The 4 sons visited me this afternoon, said Chief Brown. They wanted help in finding the hidden will. The 4 sons visited Chief Brown. One of them the thief was faking, said Encyclopedia. What makes you think that? Asked Mrs. Brown. The crooked son really doesn't want the will found, since he has nothing to gain. The poem tells him that he is left out of it. Besides, if the will is found, everyone will learn he is the thief. I hadn't thought of that, admitted Chief Brown. Encyclopedia put down his fork and settled back in his chair. He closed his eyes. He always closed his eyes when he did his heaviest thinking. Mrs. Brown said, I don't understand Mr. King. He must have been a nice man to give magic shows at schools. Why should he want to leave his money to the Magicians' Union rather than to his own sons? None of the sons, even the honest ones, worked very hard, said Chief Brown. Mr. King was a demanding father. He was probably disappointed in them. Encyclopedia opened his eyes. That was the sign that he was ready to ask the one question that would break the case. Is there anything odd about one of the sons? He asked. I mean, is one different in any way from the other three? Chief Brown thought a moment. Then he said, 3 of them are over 6 feet tall, but Arthur is much shorter, he said. Frank is the only one without a mustache. Only John wears glasses. Charles is blonde and the others are dark-haired. Does that tell you where Mr. King hid his will? Asked Mrs. Brown, puzzled. Yes, Dad just added another clue to the ones I already have, answered Encyclopedia. Mr. King wanted to give his sons a chance at finding the will, but he didn't want to make it too easy for them. The boy detective forked the last piece of meatloaf from his plate. Mr. King, he said, hid the will - where? 5. The case of the mysterious thief. Encyclopedia had a chance to solve a mystery at lunchtime when Sally suggested they bike to Mario's restaurant. We've got enough money saved up, she said. We can pick up a pizza and something to drink and eat lunch by the duck pond. A neat idea, said Encyclopedia. If we have any leftovers, we can feed the ducks. Mario's restaurant was on 4th Street. When the detectives arrived, only 4 tables were being used. It was 10 minutes past noon. The detectives went to the takeout counter. While waiting to give their order, Encyclopedia had a chance to study the room. Against the wall stood a row of tables for 2, empty except for a middle-aged couple. The man was slender and sat with his back to the wall. Facing him was a beefy woman in a tight brown dress. They were eating spaghetti. 3 men and a very fat woman sat at a table by the window. They were sharing a pizza. The woman ate daintily with a knife and fork. The men used their fingers and talked with their mouths full. At a table near the takeout counter were 2 men and 2 women drinking coffee. The men were arguing about baseball. The women seemed bored. At the 4th table were 5 young men wearing the uniform of the telephone company. They were eating submarine sandwiches and joking with a waitress. A bearded cook appeared at the takeout counter. What'll it be, kids? He inquired. 1 all-the-way pizza and 2 large root beers, please, said Encyclopedia. Ready in a few minutes, said the cook. You can wait over there. He pointed to a bench next to the cash register. Encyclopedia and Sally sat down, their backs to the tables. Something funny is going on here, whispered Sally. I didn't notice anything, replied Encyclopedia. What is it? Sally shrugged uneasily. I'm not sure. I can't quite put my finger on it. A few minutes later, the beefy woman in brown and the slender man stopped at the cash register. They paid their check and left. The next to depart were the 5 telephone company men. As they stopped to pay, a scream sounded from the rear of the restaurant. Trouble, said one of the men. He dropped 2 bills hastily by the cash register. Let's get out of here. Police! Call the police, a woman screamed. While the bearded cook rushed to a telephone, the rest of the customers rushed for the door. No one wanted to get involved. Within 3 minutes, Officer Carlson drove up in a patrol car. Encyclopedia and Sally followed him to a large table in the rear. Seated around the table were the only persons remaining in the restaurant, the bearded cook, 2 waitresses, Mario himself, and a dark-haired young woman with a bruise on her jaw. They all started chattering at the sight of Officer Carlson. He had trouble quieting them. It was a while before he was able to piece together what had happened. Every Tuesday Mario had the cash from the business put in the bank. The dark-haired young woman was his daughter, Isabel. As it was Tuesday, she had started for the bank with the money in an envelope in her purse. She never got there. I stopped in the ladies' room to freshen my makeup, she said. I heard the door open behind me. The only thing I ever saw was a fist. A waitress had discovered her on the floor, unconscious. Her pocketbook lay open. The envelope with the money was gone. Officer Carlson said, who knew about